All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar. We are beginning talking about organic orchard, crop, and agroforestry systems for the Northeast US. I can already see there's some people hanging out in the chat. That's great. We would ask that if you have questions for us during the presentation, to please put those into the Q&A function. I'm going to be monitoring that as we go, and I will interrupt CJ and Corey if it seems fit with some of these questions as they come up, and we'll also try to answer some of them as we're going in the actual typed question and answer section. But please don't try to, well, you can put questions into the webinar chat, but I probably won't see them. We'll also have some time at the end for you to, ask some more questions, and we'll try to answer some more questions then. So we'll both be trying to answer questions as we go, and also some time at the end. With that, I think we're gonna really get started into the meat of the matter here. I'm really excited that we are working with Propagate and are able to give this presentation. So let's kick it off. So I'll introduce myself, and then I'll let CJ and Corey introduce themselves as well. And CJ will give a little bit of a background about Propagate and where he works. And I think most of you probably have heard of Rodale if this is the webinar you're coming in from our site. But my name is Lee Archer. I am Rodale's Perennial System Scientist, and it has been my work has been focused on establishing Rodale's Perennial Systems and Agroforestry Research Program here at our main campus in Pennsylvania. So I'll pass it off to CJ for him to introduce himself and a little bit about Propagate, if you don't mind, CJ.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Lee. Yeah, my name is CJ Buzzy. I'm a agroforestry project manager for Propagate. I'm based in Vermont, so most of my work is primarily in the Northeast, but I've had the great opportunity and pleasure to work with Lee for the last 2 years on some projects in Pennsylvania, namely a silvopasture installation at the home farm in Kutztown. What Propagate does is work with landowners to design best fit agroforestry systems for their unique context, whether that's geographic, climatic, or economic, or ideally all three. And we can provide support in really any aspect of that, from the design stage to procurement to a turnkey installation. And we'll be able to talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. Corey?
Hi, thanks, CJ. I'm Corey London. I'm a research technician at the Kutztown location, and I'm in the Perennials department. So with a number of our research projects that we're working on, I'm kind of out in the field, kind of collaborating and working with Lee, our scientist, and our new postdoc.
Awesome. Thanks, Corey. So let's get sort of into what we're talking about today, which is agroforestry. So the whole goal of this talk today is to hopefully you guys are going to walk away with knowing what agroforestry is, knowing how perennial crops are used in the context of agroforestry practices, specifically how growers are using these practices in the Northeast US today. We want to be able to touch on some of the challenges that people are facing and how they're navigating some of the challenges associated with agroforestry. We'll also talk a little bit about what Rodale's research looks like with agroforestry and next generation orchard crops. And then we will end up with talking about what sort of support is available for growers who are interested in designing and implementing these systems. So agroforestry itself, there is a USDA definition of agroforestry, and that's the intentional integration of trees into crop and animal farming systems to create the environmental, economic, and social benefits. I think I often get a lot of questions about what is the difference between agroforestry and just orchard crop systems with a cover crop. And I think the idea of intentionality and the purpose of it is to create these environmental, economic, and social benefits. I do think it comes down to a little bit about the mindset of the thing. I mean, you can argue definitions about what agroforestry is versus orchard crops, but I do think that deep down it has to come with a little bit of the mindset of an intentional integration to create benefits. So we're going to walk through each of the USDA defined practices that encompass agroforestry. I'm really excited that we have CJ here from Propagate because he is an agroforester practitioner in action, the best of the best. So he's going to walk us through what these practices are and how we're seeing them utilized in the Northeast specifically. So CJ, you want to kick us off with
Yes.
What do we have?
Thanks. Yes, of course. Thanks, Lee. Yeah, I think Lee hinted on something very, very important there that I just want to emphasize. Agroforestry can look like it looks like a lot of different things. It is highly dependent on the context of your geography, your climate, what your goals are, how much time you have to manage these systems. And there are these USDA buckets that we generally define different types of systems as, but I just want to emphasize those lines can get a little blurry, and there's certainly some crossover. So for any particular farm, you're going to see some blending between the different practices. And with that, we'll get into them a little bit. So riparian forest buffers, at their simplest level, are strips of perennial, so meaning trees or shrubs, vegetation that is adjacent to agricultural areas and critically adjacent to waterways. So whether that's a stream, a pond, a lake, anywhere that there's water or the land is being influenced by water moving through that landscape, we can roughly define that as riparian. The reason that it's really critical to have these buffers is, I mean, we hear issues all the time about agricultural runoff, whether that's in the form of excess nutrients, in the form of chemical pesticides, or anything like that. And what these trees and shrubs can help do is really capture and sink some of that into the soil before it gets into the waterway. Another benefit for the farmer is, I mean, I'm based in Vermont. We've been dealing with flooding annually now. So another really critical thing is, how do we actually stop the force of water coming up into our low-lying agricultural fields and also stop debris and sediment from accumulating there? And riparian forest buffers can really help us achieve that. Beyond that, there's ways to make these economically viable, and incentivize farmers to plant them on farms voluntarily, instead of being told by a state or federal agency, hey, you have to have trees between your corn and soy field and this stream.
I want to add in right there, CJ, that was an image from our Pacific Northwest Organic Center out in Rockport, Washington. So that is our Rodale's newest research site. So if anyone is on the Pacific Northwest coast, we are, as you can see, very close to the Skagit River there, and riparian buffer areas are going to be critical on our ongoing research out there.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, another example of a real riparian system. So this is at one of our larger chestnut plantings in Kentucky. And in these plantings, we have a set amount of biodiversity. It fluctuates a little bit, that we're generally aiming for, because we don't want to just go out and plant chestnuts. We're trying to include biodiversity. So in a setting like this, where there's a notable riparian area, and you can see that there's actually water moving out of this pond and into a drainage towards the top right of that image, we're going to be selecting species that are appropriate for that riparian context. This is actually an image of taken at the top of the Rodale home farm. And what it's really showing is a windbreak. So wind it's not always a bad thing in an agricultural setting. Certainly for a lot of perennial crops and fruits, and really anything, you need a little bit of airflow that helps us reduce fungal disease pressure, keeps the plants happy, can dry it out after a major rain event. But too much can start to desiccate leaves, because you have that drying effect of wind moving over the leaves. It can also dry soil out. It can lift soil particles into the air and move them out of our farming system when we'd rather keep them squarely on the ground. So windbreaks, there's lots of different forms that these can be. They can be made up of deciduous trees that drop their leaves in the winter. They can be made up of conifers that can actually help break snowdrifts from entering farm fields. Because if you get a huge accumulation of snow at the edge of a farm field throughout the winter, it's going to take it a lot longer to dry out in the spring. So here's an image from Propagate's app Overyield. Overyield, in quick summary, is a agroforestry design application. It helps farmers both design systems on the ground, and offers a lot of really valuable and customizable insights into the economics. So this is a real farm in the Schoharie Valley in New York. If anyone's familiar with that valley, it's a very agriculturally productive area. Of course, at one point, being in New York, it would have been entirely forested, but as land was cleared for agriculture, a lot of those trees were cut down. So while it's still a really valuable, productive area, the prevailing wind is an issue, and it can cause issues for farmers that are farming on that land now. In this specific context, the farm operators were actually concerned about drift coming in the form of pesticide and herbicide from adjacent fields. So you can see that if the prevailing wind was coming from the southwest, we've sited the windbreaks to capture some of that drift. And you have to be aware that whatever trees you plant there might be harmed by those chemicals, but the trade-off is you're not getting those chemicals into your agricultural area where you have your high value crops.
And CJ, just a question on windbreaks. I know there in the previous slide, there was an indication they could also called timber belts. So can you just off the top of your head, list a couple of the species that you guys really like to work with for windbreaks, whether you get any economic value from those, whether people ever plant crops as windbreaks? Is that something that you've ever seen before?
For sure. Yeah, that's a terrific question. In the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, I'm always going to steer towards really hardy, fast-growing things like black locust, improved black locust, hybrid poplar. Hybrid poplar is going to grow extremely fast relative to other things you could select. So if your goal is a quick result for that system, those are the kind of things you want to look at. Depending on what your goal is, it is possible to grow really anything in a windbreak. It's just knowing that you're probably not going to be able to farm it to the same level of efficiency or optimization that you would if it was in a crop field. And certainly if you do have a concern about something like herbicide, you're going to want, and you want to have, let's say, elderberries in your windbreak, you're going to want to have a few rows of a somewhat sacrificial tree to protect those elderberries if you're hoping to get some kind of crop out of them.
Awesome. Thanks, CJ.
So forest farming is a really interesting and somewhat niche form of agroforestry. I won't spend a ton of time talking about it in this context because there's fantastic resources, experts, and field days out there, which I'm happy to connect anyone who's interested with those resources. But roughly what we're talking about here is, instead of taking trees into an agricultural setting, we're kind of taking some agricultural practices and bringing them into the woods. Things we commonly see are American ginseng cultivated under canopy. Of course, mushroom production is a really common one, and it actually can fit in with a lot of other types of agroforestry practices that involve clearing of woodlands. You could imagine, mushrooms, they're mostly water. They don't want a lot of wind. They don't want a lot of sunlight. So it's a way to add some agricultural value to a working or otherwise just existing timberland.
Thanks, CJ. I have one question. Again, I want to reiterate, if people could please put questions and answers into the Q&A function. But going back to windbreaks real quick, because I know we're not going to focus on that for the rest of the presentation. How high, do you have a recommendation for how high trees would need to be to create sort of ample wind, as Scott put it, wind breakage?
Super good question. I'm going to say that depends entirely on where the site is. So if it's up at the top of a hill and you have really strong winds, you're going to need it. I actually would say it's going to require more of a certain density instead of height. Height definitely comes into it. And there's, I could have included them in this presentation, but I'm happy to pass them along. There's actually some calculations that you can do that will tell you how tall you ideally need your windbreak to be to accomplish X amount of protection Y feet into your field. I hope that's a helpful answer. And again, I'm happy to reach out with specifics to help you out there.
Cool. Thanks, CJ.
So one that I get really excited about, and I had the pleasure of doing a webinar a few weeks ago with Rodale about, is silvopasture. Silvopasture is the integration of trees or shrubs into livestock systems. We do this for a number of reasons. The two primary reasons are to provide shade. Animals that are shaded are likely to be cooler. And when animals are cooler, they're more likely to eat. And when they eat, they gain weight, which could be, it translates into sellable meat and or milk or whatever animal product we're looking to get. So there's a lot of benefits there. The other main reason we think about silvopasture is to provide some kind of forage or fodder value to the animal. So That's not to say you can't do both. That's the best system when you can accomplish both of those goals, but it's to say there's a lot of different ways to approach silvopasture. And one of the critical things to think about is silvopasture can be made by bringing trees into an existing forage system. So like, let's say a hay field or some kind of rotationally grazed area. And we call that silvopasture by addition because you're adding trees. There's also silvopasture by subtraction. This is actually an example of silvopasture by subtraction. This is a farm in Watkins Glen, New York. And you can see that what's happened here is some thinning there's been some timber thinning, and what that has allowed is sunlight to reach through the canopy of black locust, black walnut, and I believe there's some birch in there as well. Both systems have a lot of really critical design considerations to get right and to think through before you start putting these systems in the ground. But I did just want to flag that there are these two different things that are still called silvopasture.
And a lot more information about silvopasture is available at the Rodale website, old webinars. We talked for a whole, I think it was probably at least an hour about silvopasture. So please check out that previous webinar on our website. And this webinar will also be recorded and posted to our website in the next few weeks.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, that's a great point. So again, yeah, silvopasture could even look like this, where we have chickens running around underneath a canopy, we'll call it a canopy in this case, of elderberries. What this is doing is providing the chicken shelter. Chickens they're a forest bird historically. They feel safest if they have cover from above. It's protecting them from birds of prey, other predators, and it's also giving them some diverse forage opportunities because these shrubs are actually attracting a lot of different insects that wouldn't normally be there if it was just a grass pasture. And in turn, the plants are also getting fertilization, they're getting some amount of weed removal that might not be terribly significant, but the chickens are helping keep herbivorous insects populations down. All right, alley cropping. Alley cropping is the production of annual or perennial crops between rows of trees and shrubs. So again, like all of these things, it can look a lot of different ways. A really common example that Propagate has a lot of experience in is taking hay out of maturing chestnut fields. So what that does is it allows us to get an actual agricultural crop to offset some of the value that we're losing by not having those trees producing yet. So by the time that these trees are 10, 15, 20 years old, they're going to be producing a lot of nuts. They'll start to shade out the hay. Maybe hay is not a viable crop to pull out of those, but in the meantime, we're able to actually get something sellable and valuable out of there. But alley cropping can look a lot of different ways. You could have very wide alley cropping at like 120-foot spacing, or you could have something that's at 20 or 10-foot spacing. It really just depends on what you want to be growing in between the rows. And as I mentioned, it doesn't have to be annual or forage production. This is a farm in New York that's growing hybrid poplar, and it's also growing rows of black currants between the tree rows.
CJ, when it comes to alley cropping,
yep.
Does it come down to the idea of intentionality between just growing a cover crop versus growing like a cash crop? Is that really how the definition is between an orchard and an agroforestry system? Is that what your experience has been as well?
Yeah, that is a great question. And there is a line, there's kind of a moving line that I see where you could have an alley cropping orchard system. And then at some point, unless you're intentionally managing that alley to have, whether it's economic or ecological benefit, it does kind of shift more towards an orchard system. That's not a negative thing in my opinion. But it is, it's a little blurry. And I think the distance between tree rows feeds into that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
If you have 100-foot alleys, you're probably going to be able to crop something in between there for the life of the system. If you only have 20-foot alleys, at some point you're going to have enough shade that you're going to have to really be considering if it's still viable to call it an alley cropping system or try to farm it as such.
Agreed. Yeah, we can't put everything, we've got round pegs and we're trying to put things into square boxes. So we do have to have some flexibility with definitions, and nature does its own thing anyways. So
right, and things are dynamic and change, and I mean, even agroforestry definitions have changed over the years. So who knows what we're at, how we define all these things by the time these systems mature.
true.
So, like any agricultural system, there's a lot of considerations that go into agroforestry and orcharding in general. Oftentimes, combining multiple things can actually add complicating things, but so we're looking to leaders like Rodale to help us sort out some of those issues. So I'm really excited to hear what Corey has to say about weed management and agroforestry systems.
Thanks, CJ. That's a great introduction. I do want to say, I think that a lot of the research department, and with Perennials especially, a lot of our priority is to kind of meet the needs of growers and farmers who are wanting to implement these techniques. So I'd say half of our approach, or one side of it, is kind of looking towards emerging opportunities with orchard crops like hazelnuts and chestnuts. And so we'll hear a little bit more about that later in the presentation. And half of that is going to be about problem solving for the kind of things that pop up with problems like weed management and organic systems. So just to talk a little bit about one of our experiments that we're doing here at Rodale. This is our first year with this study. We started earlier this spring. So this is our research plot. We have a high density orchard. So if you've ever been to the Kutztown location, this is just partway down the road across from Siegfrieddale Road near our visitor center. So we have 6 different treatments that we're looking at and kind of trying to study the impact it has on weed development throughout the year, as well as a slew of other factors for soil health and crop health. So we have a foam treatment that we're collaborating with a company called Weeding Tech, and so it's called Foam Stream. So we'll talk a little bit about more in a minute, but for the most part, it almost compares to like a flame weeding technique in other parts of agriculture, where it's not this foam that's treating it, but the heat of the hot water that it's insulating. And so we're looking at mulch and the impact that has. We're looking at an OMRI certified herbicide. We're doing one treatment of that foam and then mulching on top to see if that compares to standard mulching, in addition to mechanical control of weed whacking, string trimming, and just an untreated control. So with that weeding technology, it's actually, the foam comes from like plant and oil-based material that just insulates that hot water. And so the hot water, if it's just applied directly, it'll get lost in steam. But with that insulation, it can reach the hot enough temperatures to go down 1 to 2 centimeters underground. It kills all the weeds, it kills seeds and spores. So it's very effective. But throughout the season, there's always going to be new seeds, new spores blowing in. So in kind of looking at some of our data, in addition to weeds, we are looking at the emergence and development of fungal diseases and how that spreads throughout the orchards, trying to see if there's any impact that the treatments have on that, because a lot of times the understory of these orchard systems are where a lot of those fungal diseases and insects are going to be working and developing, and we'll see kind of how that might be affected on the apple harvest and on the weed development. So we're looking at a number of different fungal diseases. We're seeing what pests we're finding. So if you have your own orchards, if you grow apples, I'm sure you know this apple maggot, I'm sure you know plum curculio. They definitely have an impact on that harvest by the end of the season. And we're looking at volumetric water content of the soil. And we're sending out soil samples twice a year to kind of see a bunch of other factors of soil health metrics. So like organic carbon and micro and macro aggregate stability, some extractable protein, and mineralization, carbon mineralization potential. So here we're going to walk through just a few initial pictures of some of our weeds and how they're looking. So comparing May through August, we're seeing in our untreated control, those weeds are really growing strong. But comparing that to the foam treatment, initially, right as it's applied, it looks great. It kills everything off. And then throughout the season, we do 3 treatments throughout the year of the foam, but weeds are going to be growing back. But it's a noticeable difference to the untreated. With mulch, we'd hope to see that the mulch stays throughout the year, but weeds are just so resilient. They're still going through. And there's a minor impact that we are hoping to see when we have the foam and mulch combined. So anecdotally, it does make a small amount, but when we start kind of getting into the weeds of the actual statistical significance of the data that we're finding, we only have our first season so far. But what we are finding in terms of hard data is mulching, whether or not it's the foam and mulch or mulch alone, does have a significant impact in comparison to just the foam and herbicide. But when looking at those soil health factors that we send into labs outside of our Kutztown location for analysis, in our microaggregate stability, that we're seeing that there is almost double the amount of the percentage of microaggregate stability in our mechanical control treatment. So that's with the weed whacking compared to the mulching itself. So I think mulching in general, there's a lot of benefits for weed suppression, but I think a lot of growers have a lot of concerns about if it's causing oversaturation of roots, causing root rot, that creating more and more of a habitat for those negative pests that we don't want to be having. So to kind of see this strong difference with the mechanical control and what benefits that offers, we'll with our data coming in the next few years, we're really hoping to have something really worthwhile to show and suggest for growers.
Awesome. Thank you, Corey. Yeah, we look forward to seeing what happens in years 2 and beyond, and stay tuned to the Rodale website and keep in tune with our social media. And I'm sure you'll continue to see results emerging from Corey's project. There's one question I'm seeing in the chat about irrigation and whether the orchard was irrigated. I can answer that. No, the orchard itself where we're running this trial is not irrigated. As Corey mentioned, one of the biggest challenges that people have actually seen is oversaturation due to mulch in the past. And so this is all going to be very dependent on how much rain we get each year. So we currently do not have irrigation in that orchard that's functioning. So in years when it's dry, perhaps the mulch is acting as a benefit in terms of holding on to soil moisture. But we have seen in the past, previous researchers have shown that oversaturation is more of an issue with the mulch. So who knows what that Pennsylvania weather is going to give us. Yeah, so now that we've talked through some of the agroforestry systems, CJ and I want to take a few minutes here to, I don't want to pick favorites, but talk a little bit about our favorite crops and species that we see as really viable for organic production in an agroforestry system in the Northeast. Really excited to have CJ here as chestnut expert, and I'll let you take it away and talk to us about, try to convince us chestnuts are the way to go for the next few minutes.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, but before we get into these two specific crops, what I just really want to emphasize something, that these were not just perfect panacea agroforestry crops right off the bat. There's been a ton of work that's gone into breeding. There's been a lot of investment. There's been whole careers that have gone into making these viable for agroforestry systems and for farmers to actually put them onto the landscape. And I want to encourage everyone to think about, what is the template that we follow to get other crops into greater acceptance where we're actually starting to see widespread adoption of them? That's a huge question. I don't have the answer to that, but I just want to kind of plant that seed there that there's nothing particularly special about these other than people have really invested the time and they saw the potential value there. So the first one we're going to talk about is chestnuts. And I want to be very careful and clarify right off the bat, we are not talking about American chestnuts. American chestnuts, unfortunately, are very susceptible to chestnut blight, which is an introduced disease. It is not a case of if it will get blight and die, it is a win. Sometimes American chestnut will die back to the ground. They'll keep growing back. It's not always going to just kill the tree right off the bat, but it does create a serious barrier to commercialization of that crop. While it'd be really cool, and there's a lot of research being done to bring American chestnut back, right now we're talking about Chinese chestnuts. That's primarily the crop that I have the most experience with. It's the one that I would recommend to growers where there's been a lot of work to develop really high quality, commercially viable cultivars. So just some quick just some quick thinking about chestnuts here. As I mentioned, there's been a lot of work from universities and private individuals to lay the groundwork for an industry to develop on this crop. Historically, most of the demand and production has been in Europe and in Asia, but we are starting to see an increase in a domestic market, which is really exciting. People are becoming, whether you're in agriculture, adjacent to it, or just are interested in the effect agriculture has on the environment, you're aware of the fact that, our conventional annual production paradigm of producing food has some pretty serious ecological effects. And I think people are really starting to cue in on what are things that we can be growing to provide regeneratively grown calories to get into our food system. And we see chestnuts as a really critical piece of that puzzle. It's not the whole puzzle, but it is a piece, and certainly something we want to keep promoting and investing in.
CJ, what's your favorite way to consume chestnuts?
Let's see. I really like the fact that chestnuts can be ground into a flour. You can do a lot of baking with them. I admittedly don't have a ton of experience with that, but I have tried some things that folks have made with things that are, I don't know if they're fully chestnut flour or at least a strong component of chestnut flour that are quite delicious. It's nutty. I think it tastes like what you expect it to taste like in a weird way. I don't really know if that's clear, but it's very enjoyable. Great. So just a little plant biology and how that kind of feeds into some of our considerations as we design systems that involve chestnuts. Chestnuts are wind pollinated and they're monoecious, meaning they have male and female flowers on the same tree, but generally they cannot self-fertilize and produce viable nuts. So what that means is you need to have trees within close enough distance that wind pollination is viable. That can be hundreds of feet generally, but we're putting trees within 20, 40, 10, 15 feet of one another. So that doesn't usually end up being an issue. Something interesting about that is that's actually how breeders have stumbled upon some really high quality cultivars, is you have this constant pollen exchange. So if you have a mother block where you're trying to get seed from it, you might end up with a really, really standout crop one year from pollen that has drifted in from your neighbor's chestnut planting. So it's really interesting. I think it speaks a lot to the value of genetic diversity in our food system in general, because you never know when you're going to stumble upon something that is highly resistant to XYZ or more precocious or more productive or any other agricultural benefit. So what makes chestnuts special? Why would we consider growing them in the Northeast? A really critical one is that chestnuts bloom relatively late compared to a lot of other nut producing and fruit producing things we're used to seeing on our landscape. I'm sure most folks, if they were in the fruit world or farming of any kind, remember, I believe it was in late May of 2023. Definitely up in the Hudson Valley and in Vermont, we had a really late frost, and it kind of devastated orchards and vineyards and things like that. So the longer that we can push that bloom into the growing season, the more protection we have from those intermittent late frosts. It's not a guarantee that it'll never happen, but it de-risks it a little bit. I won't read all of these, but one thing I think that's really interesting about chestnuts, that makes it stand apart from our other nut producing trees, is that chestnuts are not a mast species. So if you're familiar with trees like oaks, or a lot of the other northern hardwood nut producing trees, they have a technique called mast, where they will, through communication channels that I don't believe are fully understood, they can coordinate a massive push of acorns in one year. I think last year was actually one of those years. And what that does is satiates all the predators. So the squirrels, bears, deer, anything that eats those nuts, they just can't eat enough of them to actually reduce the population. So the next generation or the next year, you see a lot more survival of those seeds. While that's a really interesting survival technique, it makes it very hard to commercialize and bring these trees into an agricultural setting. Chestnuts do not act that way. They're going to produce every year once they hit maturity. Of course, you're going to have ups and downs where you have better seasons, you have worse seasons, but you don't have to rely on that boom and bust cycle. Something I just think that's a really interesting thing that separates chestnuts out. What are the risks, or I hesitate to even call them downsides, but just really considerations here? Like any perennial crop, it takes a while for trees to get to their full production. Chestnuts, you will start seeing some production as early as year 4 or 5, but your peak production probably isn't hitting until 7 to 10 years. And then, of course, they have several decades of productive life after that. We're not there yet, but it's possible if there's enough small growers, the on-process fresh market could start to get saturated. But I honestly see that as an opportunity because that's going to encourage growers to get together, form cooperatives, invest in processing equipment, and be able to get value-added chestnut products onto the broader market. So again, not a perfect crop, not resistant to everything. There's a number of insect and fungal diseases, but just 2 that I wanted to call out and kind of just frame some of the different how we control these in a production system. Chestnuts are not terribly distantly related to oaks, and thus they're susceptible to a disease called oak wilt. Oak wilt is spread through wounds in the tree trunk, but it's also spread through underground grafting of roots. So if you have a tree that gets via an injury becomes infected with oak wilt, it can actually spread it to its neighbors. So the primary method of controlling oak wilt in a production system is to create we call it a fire break. And that fire break is actually just several rows of unrelated species. So if you start to see an outbreak in one portion of your orchard, hopefully by the time it gets to that fire break, it's isolated somewhat. And then you can really control that specific outbreak without having to worry about it spreading underground to the rest of your orchard. Again, chestnut blight is the main consideration. It's why we're growing Chinese chestnuts on the East Coast. Highly resistant, but they still get it. It can be degrees of severity depending on the health of the tree. It rarely impacts its production value, but it certainly can. So it's just something to be aware of. And it really speaks to how critical it is to make sure you're putting the tree in the right place. This is another screenshot from our application overyield. What we're looking at here is a specific suitability index for Chinese chestnut. It's actually built on a framework of aggregated data of soil moisture, soil texture, depth to restrictive layer, anything else that would limit or influence how and where you would put a tree on the landscape. So going from dark red to dark green, it's showing us where there's higher or less suitable land for chestnuts to be on. And the important thing there is that you want to plant, you want to plant the tree where it's going to do the best, because that's going to give it the most inherent resistance to disease and pest pressure. And that's frankly just where it's going to perform.
CJ, what are your thoughts on irrigation requirements for planting Chinese chestnut in the Northeast?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say Chinese chestnuts do not need irrigation in the Northeast. They certainly the first year that they're planted, they will need it if you're experiencing extended periods of drought. But they will certainly benefit from irrigation. And it's really just having that one lever you can pull if things start to look really, really dry. Being able to get water on them, it corresponds directly to commercial viability. So again, it's not a need like a lot of other perennial crops where like I would highly encourage anyone growing elderberries or hazelnuts or anything like that. Like you really want to have irrigation set up. Chestnuts are not quite that picky. They actually like relatively dry soils compared to a lot of other perennial crops. But certainly if you have the means or have access to grant funding, there's no harm in having irrigation.
Good answer.
And now I'm going to pass it over to Lee to talk about hazelnuts, another one of
All
our
right.
favorites.
Thanks, CJ. It was convincing, but we haven't heard from the hazelnut side yet. No, I don't think I'm joking when I say that there's any competition between hazelnuts and chestnuts. Neither CJ nor I want to see the entire Northeast covered with a single monocrop. We're all, I think, both about the idea of incorporating diversity into our cropping systems, and we see hazelnuts and chestnuts as an opportunity for growers to expand beyond what we currently have. Which is, primarily apples and peaches and some of these very difficult crops to grow organically. So we stumbled into hazelnuts, and basically the idea of our research program at Rodale is to establish what the management practices look like for the disease-resistant cultivars that have been developed for the northeastern U.S. So when we're thinking about hazelnuts, historically, the European hazelnut has not been able to grow on this side of the Rockies. We have Eastern filbert blight, which is a devastating disease to the European hazelnuts, and have made it so that the hazelnut industry was not able to develop here for many, many years. Very recently, in the last 5 to 10 years, the Rutgers University Hazelnut Breeding Program has introduced half a dozen different cultivars, which have shown multi-gene resistant to the pathogen that causes Eastern filbert blight. So this has allowed hazelnuts to grow, European hazelnuts to grow in this region. I'm sure many of you have heard of the American hazelnut. The American hazelnut is not the culinary quality, and the demand for the American hazelnut is not the same quality as it is for European. I'm not saying American hazelnut is a bad tree or a bad shrub. I think it could be great for the environmental benefits, for biodiversity, for habitat for animals, food for wildlife. But it's not that hazelnut that you see on top of your cookie in the morning. It's the European hazelnut is the one that takes the cake. That's the one that people are really looking for. So now that we have these hazelnuts, we have hazelnuts that can grow in the northeastern U.S. And the trees themselves, I'll go right to this third point here. The fact that we have not been growing hazelnuts here for the past, or European hazelnuts here for the past, hundreds of years in these huge orchards and spraying different crop protection materials on them, there is not this established pressure of pests and diseases that you would see for a lot of these other fruit crops. Maybe if hazelnuts become the next thing and every single conventional grower out there plants hazelnuts across all of Pennsylvania, yes, maybe we would see a new emergence of pests and diseases. But right now, getting in at the ground floor, we don't see that same pressure. We don't have as many pests and diseases. We, again, not trying to emphasizing that we are not trying for a monoculture of hazelnuts, but just another tool in the toolbox, another species that we could introduce into this region that could be really economically profitable. So if you could go back one slide, I just want to talk a little bit about the demand for these products. So locally, I think if you were to offer up local organic hazelnuts in a New York City farmers market, I think people would eat those up. I mean, there's very few other nuts that are as well known as hazelnuts that you can buy locally in this region. So I think that local demand could certainly be high-end restaurants, direct to consumers, farmers market, that type of thing. I think in the early years, as this is still getting going, I don't think that we'll be able to meet that demand. If we get to the point where hazelnuts have really dominated in this region, there is absolutely no shortage of a global demand for nuts and nut products. I think everyone has seen it with all the nut milks that are out there, plant-based products. People are trying to eat less meat, and nuts are a high quality source of protein for that. The nut industry in California has exploded in the past few years, and I think that California doesn't have quite the amount of water that we have, so there's no reason that California can be the only people growing nuts, and Oregon, California, that region. I think that sort of strengthening our food system and the locality of our food system through something like hazelnuts, I think could be a really beneficial opportunity for us. Thinking about how they actually grow, there are going to be a couple of challenges, like you can see in this slide. Like I said, there's not as many established pests and diseases, but you're still going to see some things. It's not like you can just plant them and forget them forever. So you can see in these images, we have what looks like a little bit of scale. We have maybe some nutritional issues in that top corner there. And then you can see deer pressure. So this was I think probably just a poorly designed tree protection or a tree guard, but the deer love playing with it. So we have these planted in an area with very high deer pressure, and making sure that you select the right tube is going to be pretty critical because deer can destroy a tube if they really want to. Another challenge with the newly released hazelnuts that Rutgers has offered up is there could be challenges with cold hardiness in some zones. So I think right now, most of the releases are recommended down to zone 6, down to zone 7, which for many parts of the Northeast might not be cold enough. Who knows, as the climate continues to change and warm, this may change, but hazelnuts have a very, very early bloom. Both the male and female flowers will come out very early. The female flowers can typically handle whatever cold temperatures we throw at them, but the male flowers might be susceptible to frost damage in the early spring. And by early spring, I mean sometimes their flowers are emerging in like January. So these are very early. In terms of processing requirements, it's not many people want to buy hazelnuts in the shell. And it's kind of a pain to shell them yourself by hand. So it's one of those what came first situations. Is it the chicken or the egg? Do we need a bunch of more hazelnut growers in order to bring in the processing equipment, or do we need to get the processing equipment on this coast before we get more hazelnut growers? The good thing is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Oregon processes a lot of hazelnuts. Italy, Turkey, all of the European countries, they process a lot of hazelnuts. So this processing equipment does exist. People know how to do it really well and efficiently, but we don't currently have it at scale here in the Northeast. And so we kind of have to see how that works and, market dynamics. But the processing requirement is going to become, I think that's on a lot of larger scale growers' mind, is that we don't have that right now. And then this next point, the nursery stock and plant propagation, I think this is rapidly becoming less of an issue. I think this year we're going to have, I think there's going to be plenty of nursery stock available, but in the past few years, sometimes it has been hard to come by these specific cultivars. But it does look like already in the past year, things are starting to already look up, and it seems like trees are going to be available. So like I mentioned, we've got a couple of challenges. CJ mentioned there was a couple of challenges with chestnuts as well. Installing, operating, managing all of the things that have to go into an agroforestry system. It's a lot to think about. So that's why we're really excited that we work with Propagate on projects, on installing projects, on helping us with what management is going to be. And we can, ultimately, hopefully help propagate with working with more farmers in order to design and implement the systems that they are, so that they're successful and will continue on. So I want to give CJ a chance to talk about how his organization works with farmers and works with growers in order to design and implement systems so that you are seeing success and, hopefully not encountering too many of these challenges. So I'll pass it to CJ here.
Appreciate it. Yeah, so I think before I get into specifically how Propagate operates, I just want to emphasize that, there's a lot of decision making that goes into these systems. We're talking about systems that, in all likelihood, if they're planted well, will potentially outlive us if they grow at the rate we hope they will. So it's important to, without putting the weight of the world on your shoulders, like really make sure you're making the best possible choices with the information you have, and just moving very carefully. There's a lot of technical service providers. We love working with new clients. We're happy to help with any aspect of this. This graph is really just to show kind of the rough cycle that we follow, so we can help folks with farm planning using our app Overyield. We have a lot of capabilities to customize economic data to specific contexts and equipment needs, labor restrictions, anything like that. And we can help farmers kind of model what that means for a cash flow on a year-over-year basis, or even on a longer term if you're thinking about if you're more investment minded. Of course, we have a full suite of equipment that we can do site prep and planting with. We have a really tremendous network of procurement partners. We have access to really high quality genetics. I think that's a key point to emphasize. these, like a lot of these crops that we're talking about are variations on, let's say, native or unimproved cultivars, but having really high quality stock that has been proven to be commercially viable is really critical. Sometimes that stuff to be kind of hard to access, and we really want to help people get that out into the world so we can actually see more plantings with these improved cultivars. Finally, these systems they cost money. Trees aren't cheap, especially really high quality ones. And that's usually a big conversation when we work with landowners and farmers is how do we get these paid for? Whether that's private financing or grant funding, there's a whole world of grants that we can help navigate and kind of just give producers options of what they can look at. So, like I said, I mean, I think one of the key things we offer is the ability to really design a system and then take it out of that system and get it in the ground in a very efficient manner. So this is another screenshot of overyield. What we're looking at here, it's a little hard to see, but we're looking at these lines that correspond to individual tree points. So these blue ones are actually black locust. Oh, pardon me. Let's say these blue ones are black locusts. Up here we have Chinese chestnuts, and you can't see, but those lines are actually composed of individual tree points. And Overyield has an export function where we can take those individual tree points and get them into a tractor guidance system. This is Bob. You can see the back of his head, but Bob is our farm operations and equipment manager. He does a fantastic job, builds all sorts of incredible tools that we get to use, and critical part of the team in a lot of ways. So what Bob is doing here is, based on those tree points that he pulled out of Overyield, he is doing a single pass, it could be two, but single pass field preparation where we are subsoiling, so we're reducing compaction. So the last time the immediate area around the tree roots has a tractor go over it, it is subsequently being subsoiled. So when the trees go in the ground, they're not having to compete with compaction layer or reduced oxygen or reduced water flow from that compaction layer. He's also tilling and breaking up that sod. If it's a crop field, that's even better because we don't have that sod to compete with the trees. This machine is also seeding. We can seed a cover crop if we want to do a fall prep for a spring planting, or we can seed permanent pasture and then mark the spray point for that individual tree all in one go. So it's really enabled us to get more acres in the ground. We're hoping that some of these innovations unlock more acres. And of course, what that corresponds to is a lot of learning. I think I could summarize a lot of these by just saying that you want to find trees and systems that fit your context instead of trying to make your context fit a specific tree. So I know Lee and I have talked about chestnuts, we've talked about hazelnuts. We're certainly energetic about both of those, but what I would really caution farmers, landowners to avoid is getting really excited about a certain crop and then making their operation work for that crop. It's a much better, I've seen much better results when you approach it holistically of saying, I'm in this climate, I have these soils, I have these existing enterprises, what can complement what I have going on now? What do I have the bandwidth to take on as a farmer? And ultimately, what's going to complement my bottom line, my ecological impact, my social impact? That could be anything. That could be a chestnut alley cropping system, or it could be a really straightforward riparian buffer made up of native species. In any of those cases, being really careful about design, site preparation, and just knowing your management considerations is a really important part of that. So again, I mentioned that funding can be a hurdle. Fortunately, right now, it's actually quite an opportunity. There is a lot of money out there specifically funding agroforestry installations. SARE always has money, and RCS has money that will fund specific programs. The Expanding Agroforestry Project administered through the Nature Conservancy is one that I'm really excited about. We're a partner on that. So there's an opportunity to work with us to access that grant funding. other ones, PASA, of course, have to call out, and catalyzing agroforestry, accelerating Appalachia, and there's many more. If anyone's interested in agroforestry in general or some of the options for grant funding, the best thing to do is just get in touch with us via our website or email. Either way works. And I would also encourage folks to look at some of the Rodale demonstration sites or get in touch with the Rodale organic consulting team. I'll at least speak to that, since that's
Yeah, no,
that's
thanks,
your-
CJ. That
yeah.
pretty much covers it. I want to, I think, leave the rest of the time for questions. I have one that's already come up in the chat going back to chestnuts here.
Sure.
Robbie has asked about best practices for weevil management and treatment pre and post harvest. I assume we're talking about the chestnut weevil here.
Yes.
Specifically thinking about organic management. I know that that's some people see or view as a challenge.
Yeah. So pre-harvest, I come from the vineyard world, where a lot of our control methods for a highly fungal susceptible crop is cultural. So what we're doing is trying to keep diseased tissue, trying to keep berries, but in this case, nuts that could become a vector for weevil. We don't want to just leave nuts sitting on the orchard floor. We want to make sure that whether or not we're processing them, actually taking them away out of the orchard or not, we're not just leaving them there. So that's one of the main things. You don't want to give weevils any food or a safe place to be. But then post-harvesting, once you bring them in, there's a hot water sanitation step that is pretty commonplace, if not ubiquitously commonplace with chestnuts. And what that does is actually, if there are weevils in the nuts, it'll kill them. So they can't harm during the immediate storage phase or as you get closer to processing.
Yeah, I totally agree that orchard sanitation is crucial for every crop, but especially with some of these nut crops. If you can get the mummies off of the tree, get things cleaned up each year, I think that that's essential. So I'm not seeing a lot of other questions in the Q&A. I know there was a little bit of a conversation going on about the hybrid hazelnuts versus the Rutgers hazelnuts. I totally agree with what people are saying in there. Rutgers hazels are probably not going to be cold hardy down to zone 5, maybe even 6 is risky. So thinking about hybrid hazelnuts, so a hybrid between the European and American, and reaching out to organizations in the upper Midwest, hazelnut breeding program, New York Nut Growers Association, and the New York Tree Crop Alliance. I think those might have some good recommendations for varieties. We are in Pennsylvania, so we do have that lucky zone 767, and are feeling like the European hazelnuts, if they're going to grow here, we may as well try those ones out. So that's kind of why we focus more here on the European hazelnut. Thinking about planting trees, CJ, we have questions about what are your steps when you're sticking a tree into the ground? Are you using any root dips, any root trimming, root soaking? What does that specifically look like for you?
Yeah, generally I'd say all of the above. We do plantings in several different ways, and it depends on the site and what we're planting. And honestly, it also depends on the scale. Whether or not we're using a transplanter, which is something we've increasingly been using on more and more projects just to improve our efficiency and be able to, service more farms and get more trees in the ground. Whether we're planting by hand or with the transplanter, we're doing some root pruning if it's needed. You don't want to, whether you're digging a hole or you have an implement ripping a trench that you're planting into, you never want to plant a tree with the roots hitting the bottom of the hole and flaring up. Sometimes instead of digging a hole 2 feet deep, it's much easier to just do a little bit of root pruning. Tree roots grow really fast, especially as trees are establishing. So you actually it can be beneficial in a lot of ways to encourage the roots to grow laterally immediate post-planting, because that's where there's going to be a lot more access to nutrients and water. They'll still grow a taproot, but yeah, we use inoculants. chestnuts, we use an endo-ecto mycorrhizal inoculum with chestnuts because they are exclusively ectomycorrhizal, and it's oftentimes very hard to find mycorrhizal products that only have that. So they get a little bit of both. We use things like kelp, azomite, anything to boost, microbiological activity in the soil, in addition to adjusting any macronutrient deficiencies that we are known from when we take soil tests during our site analysis.
Awesome. Thanks, CJ. There's one question about where we can see silvopasture and alley cropping in action. I want to start out by saying, please come check out the Rodale demonstration sites. We have established a silvopasture system in our hog facility and are planning on planting our alley cropping tree system this fall. CJ, any other recommendations for farms that you think would be interested or are typically open to public visitors that you can think of?
Yeah, I would defer to the Rodale demonstration sites just because that's, it's very accessible. There's a learning opportunity there as well if you get to visit them. I do know a few other farms. I would say the cleanest way to arrange something like that is to reach out to someone on Propagate's team if you're local to Hudson Valley, Pennsylvania area, and we'll see what we can do about getting some boots on the ground.
Awesome, thanks. I want to take maybe 2 or 3 more questions. I do want to wrap up here by about 3:05, so we don't take up too many people's time. Could you talk about, CJ, what Rodale's scope is in terms of regional ability to assist with your services? Do you give advisory services abroad is the specific question, but where regionally do you guys like to focus?
Sure. Yeah, so Propagate, our primary focus based on, well, I'll say it like that. So trees really grow best east of the Mississippi. It's where we have adequate moisture. You eliminate a huge barrier to entry by just having that reliable rainfall and not these extreme periods of drought. I know we have drought throughout the East Coast, but it is just a different level of severity. We historically have worked primarily in the Northeast, so in New York, whether that's the Hudson Valley, Western New York, certainly in Pennsylvania. We have a lot of projects in Pennsylvania. We've worked on several thousand acres of chestnuts in Kentucky, so we're definitely familiar with working at scale. In terms of our ability to provide specific farm services or operations on the ground, I would say, the East Coast is certainly, and even into the Midwest a little bit, that's something that we have some capability to do. I would need to know specifically where someone is to be able to answer that with more certainty. But our ability to provide technical service via digital site analysis or technical support on, anything that we can do virtually, we can do that anywhere. Yeah, we can do that anywhere to the best of our knowledge and ability.
Thanks. And Kyle put in something into the chat, which will help answer that question. So I want to take one last question about alley cropping and it's a 2-part question. One about windbreaks, it seems like. If height do you need trees in order to have a windbreak, or can you use some sort of like shrub? Does it have to be a tree to qualify? Does that make it what's a windbreak, or are there shrubs that will act as the same thing?
Yeah, great question. If you ask NRCS in certain states, they will tell you that there's a certain height that a tree needs to be at maturity to qualify as a windbreak. That's not a blanket thing across the country. Each state has very specific guidelines. So that's something to be aware of. But in terms of functionality, no, there's no reason that it has to be a tree. The distinction between tree and shrub, I think, according to NRCS, is 13 feet. I could be at maturity. I could be mistaken about that. But it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If I'd say the best thing if you're really trying to have an effective windbreak is actually have some variation in final heights of things. With that, you're also going to get variation in leaf density, when leaves drop, when leaves grow. So you're just gonna add more resiliency to the system if truly functioning as a windbreak is your main goal. If you're trying to improve habitat, certainly having a mixture of shrubs and trees is going to be the most beneficial thing there, especially if they're native pollinator benefiting trees and shrubs.
Awesome. Thanks, CJ. I think we are just about out of time. I want to emphasize that you are welcome to reach out to both the Rodale and Propagate team to ask more questions, but please stay tuned if you'd like to check this webinar. It'll be on the website in the next few weeks. And we really appreciate you guys taking the time to come out. There's a couple of links in the chat that I can see right now. Thanks, one about Savannah Institute and others. So if you want to save your chat, go take a screenshot real quick, because I think that disappears as soon as we exit out of this. But thank you to Corey. Thank you to CJ. We look forward to hearing how everyone here progresses with their agroforestry planting. Please reach out with questions and have a great rest of your Wednesday afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for joining. Take care.